We resume our studies of the book of Exodus today at chapter 1, and we're looking together at verses 8 to 22. God had commanded Adam to subdue the earth. We read this in Genesis chapter 1 verse 28. However, unusually the result of sin entering the world has meant that men and women try to subdue one another. Thus the world is full of people who eagerly seek to power over others and who will do everything they can to hold on to that power. The history of the world is full of examples of those who have gained or even usurped power and have then been haunted by the possibility that others may overthrow them. Usually they've dealt with all real or supposed threats against them with great harshness and violence. This was so in Egypt for God's people. A new Pharaoh saw the people of Israel as a threat to his power and rule, as we see in verses 8 to 10, and he was determined to act against them. We can easily understand Pharaoh's anxiety at the increasing number of the Israelites. His own father had usurped the throne of Egypt, and in the early years of his own reign he was probably still trying to establish his own authority. On the identity of the Pharaoh, incidentally, I've included a short additional section at the end of this study. But the threat of the Israelites to Pharaoh was doubtless seen as very great indeed. So he decided, as many others have in his situation, to adopt a policy of deliberate and ruthless repression. His first attempt is described in verses 11 to 14, where he tried to keep the Israelites so busy making bricks that they could have little energy left to plot against the king. His success was, however, threatened by the continuing blessing of God on the people, as we see in verse 12. The greater the oppression by Pharaoh, the more the Israelites grew in numbers. Although the one who is flexing his muscles was the greatest power on earth in the ancient world, we are implicitly already assured that the battle is an uneven one. The question is not who will win the contest, but how it will be achieved. The king immediately decided to resort to more drastic measures, as we see in verses 15 to 21, and to do so by attempting to have all Israelite baby boys killed at birth. This policy was vicious, but also understandable. As the surviving girls grew up, they would be forced to find husbands among the Egyptians. In this way, the Israelites as a distinct people would become completely eliminated. But this also failed because Pharaoh was unable to gain the cooperation of the midwives who refused to become murderers of Israelite boys. Possibly the king believed his power would be enough to intimidate those midwives. However, once again, Pharaoh met a greater force than his own because these midwives, we are told, feared God. The midwives said that the Hebrew women gave birth before the midwives arrived. This may have been partly true. The Israelite women were probably more physically active than the Egyptian women, and this may have made childbearing easier. It's also possible that the curse of Genesis chapter 3 verse 16 was partly removed from the Israelite women, a fact which may explain the larger increase in the number of births. However, it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that the midwives did lie, but that the king could not punish them because that would have exposed his cruel plan. God, however, rewarded the midwives. We are told this in verse 21. Perhaps surprisingly, there is far less condemnation of lying in the Old Testament than Christians might expect. This is probably because the Old Testament is only too aware of the plight of the helpless, brought face to face with those authorities who have rejected all mercy and morality. To be killed for the sake of the truth is a noble ideal, but all too often the skilled interrogator knows how to frame his questions so that even silence can betray and condemn others to death. Thus, if Christians in similar situations today have sometimes lied, we should be wary very wary of condemning them. Finally, Pharaoh issued his last decree. We read this in verse 22. Every male baby had to be thrown into the Nile. This great river was regarded by the Egyptians as one of the most powerful gods in the ancient world, and specifically in Egypt. It's probable, therefore, that the king had a religious reason for acting in the way that he did. Let the gods of the Nile decide what to do with these troublesome Israelites. But God had another idea, and used, as we shall see, that very river to preserve Moses, his deliverer. These verses describe the attempt of one king, though perhaps the most powerful man in the ancient world, to eliminate the Israelites and at the same time destroy the purposes and the promises of God that were contained within them. However, there is another reality illustrated in this story. The King of Kings was also active. God was concerned to preserve his people and his promises. He also allowed much suffering and tragedy. He did this then, and sometimes does the same today, to arouse the people of God from their dependence on the comforts provided by him, and to awaken them to their calling to be faithful witnesses to him. Finally, I want to try to identify the Pharaoh who is mentioned in this chapter. We cannot be finally sure which Pharaoh of ancient Egypt is mentioned here, since only his official title is given. However, according to 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1, the Temple of Solomon, begun in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, was started 480 years after the Exodus. From our knowledge of ancient history, we know that Solomon began to build in 966 BC. Though many have doubted whether the figure 480 is to be understood literally, it does seem increasingly likely that it is an accurate figure. This would give a date for the Exodus as about 1445 BC, which was during the reign of Amenhotep II. Since the events described in Exodus 1 occur at least 80 years before the Exodus, for Moses was 80 when the Exodus commenced, a date of about 1525 BC would seem appropriate for the events of Exodus chapter 1. We can probably therefore identify the Pharaoh who oppressed the Israelites with Amenhotep I. This is the view I agree with. However, there are still many who argue for a later date, and further details of such views may be found in Bible dictionaries.